So our next speaker is going to bring us to the other side of the rice world, in a sense. Kathryn Edgerton-Tarpley is an associate professor of late Imperial and modern Chinese history down at San Diego State. And San Diego State is probably one of the strongest places really for, I think, historically for outreach in world history. It's like a hugely, they have wonderful people down there. So she's in a heartland of that. She may not realize that how rich it is there compared to everywhere else. So I appreciate her coming up just for that reason alone, and bringing us into China and not eating.
That's right. All right, well, good morning. It's nice to be here. I just wanted to briefly say that I love working with teachers. I do quite a few teacher workshops at SDSU, and I teach world history for teachers, so for people who are going to be future teachers. And part of why I like working with teachers is after I finished college and taught in China for a year, I did Teach for America. So some of you may know that. And they sent me to rural North Carolina, and I was doing elementary K-5 special education for 2 years. And the first year was the hardest year of my life. My favorite memory is the principal coming in to observe me without warning, and Robert was in the closet. Emotionally disturbed child, and I was just praying he wouldn't come out of the closet. Well, the principal was there. I hadn't put him in the closet. But anyway, that kind of thing. So I really admire people who teach in the public school classrooms. I think it's much harder work, quite frankly, than what I do teaching at the college level. And I'm very interested in encouraging teachers, giving teachers some ideas for how to integrate Asia more. I think the California standards are not great, quite frankly, for Asia. They're fairly Eurocentric. And so, they do cover, for example, if you cover the Irish famine, how many of you teach the Irish famine in your classes? So a few of you. I think some of what I'm giving you today, you could bring in a unit on the Irish famine. You could bring in some Chinese material as a comparison and still be covering a standard. So basically, I hope that some of these slides have primary sources that you might be able to use. Most of them are short with a high school class. I don't know about middle school, but high school, and let the kids try to make sense of them. And so, hopefully it'll be useful. All right, anyway, one red bean, food, famine, and moral choice in 19th century China, and some Ireland, although I'm much more of an expert on China than Ireland. What I'll be looking at, I want to briefly raise the question of why famine? Why am I so interested in famine? What can famine help us do as teachers or as scholars? Then I'll have a section comparing ideology of famine. How do we understand famine causation and famine victims and famine relief in 19th century China and the 19th century British-Irish world? Then we will move from the government level to the family level and talk about individual and familial choices that famine make you make, right? Horrible choices. And how cultural ideas about what is moral and immoral shape those choices. And then at the end, this is rather new for me, I haven't done much on famine foods, but it was interesting to try to think through some of this for this talk. I'll talk a little bit about famine foods in China and in Ireland, since this is about food, right? Okay, so briefly, why famine? A South Asianist named Paul Grinow has written about famine in a way that really interested me as a graduate student and has sort of shaped my thinking. He argues that a disaster like famine activates a given culture's, helps you see a given culture's ultimate values, right? So you've been talking about food all week. Here we're going to talk about how the lack of sufficient food is so threatening and so horrific that the choices a lack of food makes you make tell us a lot about a given ideology and what is most important for a given culture at a given time point. So we'll be seeing that. then I realized that the title One Red Bean is a sort of funny title. So I just wanted to share this famine story with you. When I was a graduate student working on my dissertation, I spent a year in China. I've lived there for about 4 years total, doing archival research, but also oral history research on a famine that happened in the 1870s in China. And I was interviewing elderly villagers who had famine stories from their grandparents who had lived through the famine. And I think this was from an interview with Mrs. Tan Ruhua in a village in North China, Shanxi province. And she heard this story from her maternal grandmother. And when I heard it, I thought it was just fascinating because to me, it's very, very Confucian. And so as you read this famine story, I want you to think about how, if you're at all familiar with Confucianism, if you introduce it to students in your classes, and if not, we'll talk through it. Why is this a very Chinese famine story? How is it Confucian? Okay, so it doesn't rain, only 2 brothers left, parents are dead. The elder brother decides he's got to kill his younger brother to carry on the family line. He's going to kill his brother. His younger brother sees this and says, "Guga, older brother, why are you sharpening the knife to kill a man?" And so the younger brother begins to boil the water, and he's willing to be killed, right? He understands this. And then as he's boiling the water, he finds this one red bean at the bottom of the pot, but he doesn't eat the bean. He brings it to his elder brother and says, "Guga, you eat this so that you'll have the strength to kill me." And then his brother can't stand to kill him, and so he realizes his goodness, and according to Mrs. Tan, this one red bean somehow allowed them to maintain life. So in what way might that be a very Confucian construction of moral choice in famine? Anybody see that? Yeah.
That the elder, of course, is the one who should use the pot.
Yeah, and we're going to see that a lot, right? If you introduce, again, I don't know, but I know when I introduce Confucianism to my students, we talk about the 5 basic Confucian relationships, right? Emperor and official, father, child, husband, wife, elder brother, younger brother, friend, and friend. Only one is equal, and in all the other cases, the elder, is supposed to be the superior party, right? And the younger must give way. So in this, the younger brother, because he's a good Confucian younger brother, he's willing to die so his elder brother can carry on the family line. But in the end, that sacrifice is honored and they don't die. So a very Confucian construction, and you'll see quite a bit more of this as we go along. So basically this story, as I heard as a graduate student a long time ago, got me thinking about how Confucianism or how a particular cultural context shapes even the most horrible of choices. Okay, so why are we going to look at these 2 famines, or why did I look at these famines? Well, I think they provide really interesting examples of very different cultural responses to famine in a very similar time period, just 30 years apart. So just very briefly, some context. The Great Irish Famine, the potato famine, I think that's much more familiar to most of us, starts because of this horrible potato blight that ruins the crops 4 years out of 5 during the famine, is exacerbated by British policies, we'll get to that, and kills roughly 1 million of Ireland's 8 million people, leads another 1.5 million to immigrate, many of them to America. The North China famine, 30 years later, it's a drought famine, so it's happening here. There is a massive drought that stretches across 5 northern provinces here. Starts in 1876, people use up all their storage. 1877, people start starving en masse. The rains fail again, and it's not until the end of 1878 that you start getting rain again. North China frequently had droughts, so the Qing government did have ways of dealing with drought, but had been badly weakened by internal and external problems. I'll get to that. So they're unable to provide relief on the scale that they needed to, and so we have a huge loss of life, right? So the Irish famine has a much bigger percentage in terms of loss of life, but in absolute numbers, this is a terrible famine. Okay, and a lot of the material that I'll be sharing is from Shanxi province right here, which was the epicenter of the famine, so this province. Okay, one other just introductory thing, I'll be using a lot of famine illustrations, and I use these in my book and in an online a website at MIT that I listed on that resource sheet. So if you're interested in these illustrations, you can have easy online access to them through that. You have that, right, through the MIT Visualizing Cultures website, which is a great website for Asia. Anyway, so where am I getting these? They are from this series of woodblock illustrations from a booklet that's published, I should have given the date, in 1878 by Chinese philanthropists based in Suzhou near Shanghai. And their goal is to help, even people of iron weep when they see these illustrations and then donate to relief efforts for the famine in North China. So that's sort of the context here. The idea being that if you give famine relief, you will be blessed by heaven. Okay, so we'll see a lot of those illustrations. All right, so with that sort of general introduction, famine and ideology. How does the lack of food, what can that show us about ideology and tough choices? Michelle said that you're interested in the process of research because of the new Common Core standards. So I thought I would mention, how does someone get interested in this type of material? Well, I was a graduate student working on a term paper for a philanthropy class. And one of the sources we read early in the class claimed that only Western cultures had true philanthropy. That really annoyed me as a China person. So I decided to try to prove them wrong. And I knew, I'd read enough to know that China had a history of philanthropy too. So I wanted to have a case study that I could look at. And my Chinese was still, not great. So I started looking through this English language newspaper that's published in Shanghai, in China, by the British in the Treaty Port of Shanghai from 1850 all the way up to 1950. So it's the big English language paper in China to look for a disaster and to start getting a sense of Chinese philanthropy. And what I found was a great deal of coverage of this North China famine in the 1870s. But what really puzzled me was the British were so harsh in their critiques of Chinese or Qing dynasty relief efforts. And they seemed to think that the Qing government, what puzzled me was not that they were critical. The British were always critical of China at that point. But they weren't criticizing Qing China for doing nothing. They were criticizing the Qing government for doing too much, for intervening. And to me, I wasn't used to that. I didn't understand where they were coming from. It seemed like a very strange argument. So I started thinking, well, was the Chinese response to famine that different than British responses? And if so, why? Okay, so as a grad student, I really didn't know this, and I thought it was very interesting. So that was sort of what got me going. And then as I started reading about the North China famine, I became increasingly interested in a whole array of topics and ended up publishing a book that looks at the famine from a lot of different directions, but one of them was ideology. And my graduate advisor said, well, if you want to understand British ideas about famine, you should look at the Irish famine, right? That's our quintessential example of British ideas. And that's how I got to Ireland, just in terms of process. These were some of the critiques that I read in the Herald that I thought were odd. By unwise interference with natural laws of supply and demand, the government has hindered the import of food by private enterprise. They're not trusting to free trade, they're interfering, blah, blah, blah. It's work, not food, which the government should supply. How terrible is charity, which maintains large bodies of people in idleness. So the Chinese government was feeding large bodies of people, but they're idle, so that's bad, right? The people, they're not working. They're not building railroads or roads. They're turned into vagabonds and tramps, right? Hotbeds of crime and disease. And then the Chinese government, why are they having this famine? Well, because they've scornfully rejected Western railroads and technology, so they've only got camels and carts to get grain into the starving provinces. And finally here, and this is very similar to their logic in Ireland, the famine could be a good thing. This could be a blessing from God, really, if it teaches the Chinese a lesson, okay? And this kind of statement, and this is just one of many, many, many statements, was surprising to me. I didn't know that much about 19th century Britain. And so eventually, I came to the conclusion that these were the basic assumptions. Government intervention causes famine conditions, doesn't help. Giving free relief turns people into hotbeds of disease and crime. The only kind of relief that's helpful is work relief. And the best way to deal with famine is through science and technology. Okay, that was what I was getting from the British. So then, in the North China Herald, and then of course later in Chinese archival sources, a lot of Chinese voices, there really did seem to be a difference here. The British were saying very clearly, I should have said at the beginning that the British were dealing with their own famine in British-run India in 1877. So they were writing not only about the Chinese famine, but about what they were doing in India. And the British government's basic take was, we can't save all these lives, and it's really not our duty to do so. I mean, that's really very bluntly what they say, both in India and in Ireland. The Qing government, they couldn't save all the lives, but their rhetoric was very different. The rhetoric was, it's our duty to provide every single person with relief, right? They couldn't do that, but their rhetoric is that you should. The British, I argue, could have done more than they do, but they don't think it's their duty. They don't think that's the task of a government. So it really does seem to be rather different. So then I wanted to know why, right? How do we get to this viewpoint that the British are using in China and in India in 1877? Well, I'm going to give you some background here, and some of this may be very familiar to you. I don't know, but and then we'll do the same thing for China. How do the British come to have these ideas about famine? I would say it comes out of classical political economy, and then we see it in action in India first, and then in Ireland in the 19th century. Basically, scholars of the Irish famine, Christine Kinnelly and others, have made it very clear that in the 18th century, the British did sometimes intervene in famines. So you have British officials in India in the 18th century who do restrict the grain trade, try to lower grain prices, things like that. But then in 1876, we have Adam Smith's great, famous Wealth of Nations, basically making this very powerful argument that then gets repeated and used and exaggerated in ways that Smith may not have intended, basically arguing that dearth is different than famine. And here he would agree, the Chinese would agree. The Chinese also think that a drought you cannot avoid, right? A drought is something that comes from heaven and humans can't stop it. So Smith and the Chinese agree there. But Smith goes further and he thinks that to turn a drought or to turn a scarcity into a famine where people are dying, that happens because of government intervention in free trade. The Chinese, on the other hand, will say you turn a drought into a famine if you don't take it as a warning from heaven and act as a benevolent father and mother of the people. Okay, then you're going to have a famine. So it's a very different, they agree that they're not the same thing, but they don't agree on why. So here's Smith telling us that, a dearth has never arisen from any cause but real scarcity, and a famine doesn't arise unless you have the government intervening and making things worse, right? And then he says here that free trade is the best way of preventing a famine. So if you let the market work, then you won't have a famine. If you intervene in the market and try to force merchants not to sell grain at a cheaper price, the merchants are all going to flee the area and the price is going to skyrocket and things are going to get worse, Okay, so this Smithian analysis becomes more and more powerful over the course of the early 19th century. So about a quarter century later, we see Smith's words almost directly in the words of the Madras Board of Revenue. That's the British body that's in charge of dealing with the famine in Madras, in India. Right? So basically, once again, the unrestrained freedom of the grain market is the best preventive of famine, right? And if people unwisely try to tinker with the private grain trade, then they scare dealers away from bringing their grain, and that just makes things worse. Okay, so you see Smith making that case in 1876, and then a quarter century later, you see that it's getting carried out in India by these officials. Obviously, it's not only Smith. We have other really important thinkers whose ideas are contributing to this idea about famine. Another key contributor to the classical economic vision of famine is Thomas Malthus. Okay, so once again, extremely famous voice, writing a little bit later than Smith. And Malthus is responding to the French Revolution. It's a conservative, defensive, anti-utopian reaction to what's been going on in France. And Malthus is saying, basically, famine happens because human nature is problematic and you put your desires over your wisdom, and you keep having sex and you keep procreating, and the population growth outpaces the amount of food we have, and so you're going to have famine. But he not only thinks that famine is a result of overpopulation, but he thinks it's a cure. It's a necessary evil, and he makes that quite clear that if we don't have famine, our population will explode. So overpopulation occurs because of human nature and our lusts and inability to control ourselves. And then famine is nature, God, he's a minister himself. So God's way of dealing with overpopulation is to send a famine. And it's also a way of forcing the lazy poor to work. This is used by British officials in both Ireland and India to say, if we go and rescue the starving Indians or the starving Irish, we're interfering with nature, and we're going to waste all this money, and then their population's going to grow, and there's going to be even worse famine next year. So it's better to not intervene. Let things go their course. I mean, this is very bluntly stated. I'm not exaggerating. Yes?
So they call Malthus the prophet of doom.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. Good, yeah. Very,
It's also spoken by a man who probably never has to come in his life.
Probably. Yes, right. I agree. Yeah, so Malthus is important because of all this, but also he has he writes very fierce attacks on the old English poor law system. And this old system that had been in place since the 1600s basically says that each parish in England is responsible. You have an overseer who collects a tax, a poor tax, from everybody in the area, ratepayers, anybody who owns land, and then you use that poor rate to provide outdoor relief. That's basically, soup kitchens and food to the poor in your own parish. But Malthus argues very loudly and publicly that this outdoor relief, this parish relief system where you collect a poor tax and then you give soup to the starving in your own area, he thinks that that's interfering in the natural or the godly work of curing overpopulation. So he thinks not only is that leading to overpopulation, but it's encouraging the rural poor to be lazy and to not do their proper work because they can get soup from this poor law system. So Malthus and many other, pre-trade people who agree with Smith and Malthus attack this old poor law system. And so in 1834, the English Parliament passes a new poor law. And this says that instead of having this outdoor relief system, if you have poor in your parish, you have to send them to a workhouse. You build a workhouse, and they have to go and work, all different kinds of work in that workhouse in order to get any kind of relief. So it's very punitive because workhouses, as we know probably from the Irish famine, become hotbeds of disease, right? If you want to talk about hotbeds of disease, a workhouse is a place with very high mortality rates because you're crowding together poor, malnourished people and they spread disease. And so, I would say this is a worse system, but it's seen as a way to force the poor to work. And unfortunately for the Irish, 4 years later in 1838, the Parliament passes a new poor law for Ireland that's even harsher, but basically the same idea. We're getting rid of outdoor relief, free relief, and we're tying relief to a willingness to enter a workhouse. Okay, so that's happening right before the famine, the decade before the famine. Okay, one other important ideological strand that helps make sense of the British view of famine in the 19th century is Providentialism. And it sounds similar to Malthus, but it's not talking about overpopulation so much. Providentialism was a religious idea, widely taught by Anglican ministers and other Protestant Christians in England, that said God's hand works through history, works through social processes, and even something that looks evil to us can in fact be a lesson or a blessing from heaven. And so when you have the poor or you have a famine, this is clearly something God is bringing to teach us something. And if we just try to throw money at it, we're refusing God's lesson. So we need to be able to take the punishment or the lesson that God is teaching. It's a very moralistic reading of famine, and all too often it's we are the righteous, the people who are hungry are the ones who are learning the lesson, right? And we should not intervene to try to stop God's lesson from getting through. So unfortunately, you have this population theory from Malthus, you have the free trade theory from Smith, and you have providentialism from the church, all coming together in the decades right before the Irish famine, so that you've got clergy, you've got economists and merchants, and you've got scientists, demographers, all saying, don't intervene. If you intervene, it's going to make things worse, right? And that turns out to be a very powerful array of ideology. So this gets applied first in India, then even more harshly in Ireland. Well, no, really harshly in both, just more famously in Ireland. And I just wanted to point out some interesting connections. Haileybury College here was the college that trained people to work in the British East India Company, the English East India Company. That was the monopoly that was running the very fruitful trade in India. And many of the key personnel in the Irish famine were trained at Haileybury and first worked in India. So any guess of the last few people, I don't know, which one of these famous people, Smith, Malthus, or, well, there wasn't one providentialist, who works at Haileybury College? Does anybody know? Malthus. Okay, Thomas Malthus taught there for several decades, and one of his students was Charles Trevelyan. And if you teach the Irish famine, you know that this is sort of Satan impersonate for the Irish. He's the head of treasury during the Irish famine. He's the person responsible for giving or not giving funds, right? And he argues very strongly against intervention. And Charles Trevelyan studies under Malthus at Haileybury in the early 19th century. He then goes and works for the English East India Company in India and is an official there. And scholars of the Irish famine have argued that Trevelyan's words about the Irish and about the famine in Ireland are very much imprinted by his time in India, that he's in India looking at people who are not white and who he sees as other and not quite civilized. And he has a whole way of talking about them and about God's punishment for Indians and so on and so forth. And when he goes to work in Ireland a decade later, he takes a lot of those same ideas and places them on the Irish. And so these are very closely connected, things that you're learning at Haileybury, putting to practice in India, carrying out in Ireland. So what are the consequences of this classical economics, Providentialism, Malthusianism in Ireland? Well, I already gave you the death toll, but for those of you who teach the Irish famine, what are some of the classic issues that come out of the Irish famine? What makes Irish people so angry when you talk about the Irish famine? What do they think causes the famine? Not just the potato, right? What are they angry with the British about? Yes.
Well, the British trade policy in that while the people were starving, had no potatoes, all of the wheat and the grain was exported by the British, making money in their rubbish.
And why would the British be able to say this is a good idea? Free trade, right? So during the Irish famine, this is one of the most famous claims in the Irish famine, 30 to 40 ships per day are going out of Ireland carrying wheat and barley and oats and meat and butter, all kinds of things you could eat. And they're primarily going to England, which is quite ironic. In the worst year of the famine, the highest death rate is 1847. And during that time, you have 400,000 ships of food shipped out of Ireland. So, of course, Irish scholars, scholars of the Irish famine, not just Irish ones, will say that you have a catastrophic loss of potatoes. But had the government stepped in and intervened and said, we're going to cut off exports so that we can feed the Irish with Irish grain instead of with potatoes, you still would have had a shortage. I mean, it wouldn't have been easy. There's been a lot of debates back and forth on that. But certainly you're not going to have 1 million starvation deaths, right? You could make it a much less catastrophic thing. But the British can't do that because they've convinced themselves that will make things worse. That if you intervene like that, you're going to make things worse because you're messing with free trade. And they really believe by the 1840s, the Whigs who are in power really believe that free trade is the way to make the world work. And so they don't limit exports, right? They refuse to limit exports. So that's the most famous way that laissez-faire economics contributes to the Irish famine. Any other ideas of how this, I would say, sort of poisonous brew of ideology comes to fruition in Ireland? So exporting grain. What about importing? Another way of stopping the famine would be to import massive amounts of grain, right? But yes?
I have a slightly different time period to talk about. The famine in India in 1943.
Bengal, yeah.
Officially in 43 to 44, we extended beyond that. I experienced a little bit of it as a child. But the important thing was Churchill, who is widely admired, of course, he took that punitive approach. When some British officials said that, hey, we're taking all the grain for war. And shooting keeps coming in Bengal. Churchill didn't like that idea at all. He said that the Indians are a scrawny pagan lot anyway. So giving them a little bit more grain is going to help. I started with the Greek partisans fighting the Germans. And then he added as a postscript that if the situation is so bad, how come Gandhi is still alive? He looks pretty strong. It wasn't that bad.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Well, thank you for that. The British policy in Bengal is another example of a famine, as Amartya Sen has showed us, that's not caused by absolute scarcity. It's caused by policy choices,
And in India, the British did not want, to invest in food crops. They wanted cash crops.
Right. Exactly, like opium, for example.
Or growing more cotton, growing indigo, all the things that would help them with their textile industry. They stop people from weaving their own cloth.
Good. Yes, exactly. So that's true. I mean, we could do a lot more with India too. So I think you have a lot of similar consequences in India, but Ireland is just maybe the I thought the one that would be the most likely that you might be teaching. But Yeah, okay, so you export, you don't intervene and stop exports, you don't import massive amounts of grain. They do import some, but it's politically problematic. I'll talk about that a little more later. And then you don't believe that you can give relief without asking for work. So you have to create all this public works, but it's very, very difficult to employ 3 million people in a country of 8 million people on public works. So the public works are swamped, and the workhouses become, basically death camps, because not deliberately, but because you have the spread of disease in these work camps. And you simply cannot maintain that much public works. It's such a massive famine, but the government doesn't believe you can just simply give out food relief. That goes against their ideology. And another way, I think, the church doesn't step in the way that you might expect, because so many pastors think that this is God's lesson, we shouldn't intervene. You do have churches who don't agree. The Quakers are famous for sending relief, and not everybody agrees, but a large portion of the clergy are not stepping in because of providentialism. So it's did you have a question? Yeah.
You said that, like, the work camps, the workhouses.
Yeah.
Isn't it, well, and I'm speaking as a person of Irish background,
Yeah.
but isn't it considered a genocide that it was on purpose?
Oh.
It wasn't just a few policies, but there were so many different things going on that the British were doing that it was a genocide rather than just,
Well,
not reacting to a famine.
that's certainly one group of people. I don't agree with that. I think that's not provable in a scholarly fashion. I don't think it's helpful. I don't think we have any evidence that the British were trying to exterminate the Irish, but we have a lot of evidence that they believed that the famine should be able to work its course. But I think that's different than a genocide where you're directly, literally trying to snuff out a whole group of people. So there are certainly scholars who will argue for the genocide, but it's not, most scholars of the Irish famine don't go that far, are very cautious about using the word genocide because it implies a certain amount of deliberate murder. The British, I think a better case is neglect. I mean, willful neglect, but I think that's different than active murder, if you see my point. I mean, you don't have to agree, but that's the consensus. It's that the genocide is, I would say, kind of on the fringe of the academic world, although it's popular in sort of the Irish nationalist camp at certain periods of time. But now, yeah.
And another factor is the landlord system that exists. Where the predominant indigenous Irish, or Catholic Irish, or tenant farmers depended on the Anglo-Irish landlords, which had existed since the 1500s. And particularly in regard to the church, at this time, the penal laws time, they call it, Catholics couldn't even have a church. They had to worship out in the fields,
Yeah,
So
well,
the
that
Church
is
of England,
broken down by this point,
plus
but
the Anglo landlords, it's kind of charged.
yeah, no, I agree. I mean, yes. So, all right, well, I'm going to move on because otherwise we're really going to run out of time. But, these are just ways of thinking about how does ideology impact a response to famine. Now I'm going to give you a very different way of looking at famine that comes out of a different historical context. So how do Qing Chinese views, the Qing dynasty that runs China from 1644 to 1911, how are they different? How do they compare from British views? When you go through Qing sources on famine, there's these basic assumptions about famine that are really different from the 19th century British voice, although some of this wouldn't have been so different in the 18th century in England. So there is a shift over time. Basically, from very early times, and I'll show you some sources in a minute, Confucian Chinese, the Qing, of course, are Manchu, but they've taken on many Chinese values, and they agree with this. The basic task of a benevolent, keyword in Confucianism, government is to yangmin, or to nourish the people. And if you don't nourish the people, nothing else is going to work, right? That is fundamental. And so based on this ideology, you have to intervene if there's a drought. If heaven sends a drought, you've got to do something, right? So what do? Well, the Qing state sets up a massive state-run granary system. Okay, if you're interested in that, there's a wonderful book about that with great detail. And this granary system in the 18th century has 1 million tons of grain that is stored in key areas, many of them in North China because it's so drought prone. And the job of these granaries, every time you have a harvest, you take a certain percentage, depends on the year, and place it in these granaries, and you have to change it every year so it doesn't get old and moldy. And then when there's a drought, it's the job of the government to release grain from these granaries. So the first thing you do when there's a drought is pingtiao, which means you sell this grain from the state granary at very low prices when a drought happens. And the purpose there, the belief of the Qing state is if you flood the market with government grain that's sold at a cheap price, that's going to prevent prices from spiraling up as they usually do in a shortage, right? So first you just flood the market with low-priced grain, but that's still not going to help people who have no money, right, who have no cash. At the beginning of a drought, you also either cancel completely or lessen the amount of tax that needs to be paid in that locale. They do this all the time. And then if these first two things don't work, if people are still starving, then it's the job of the state to provide massive amounts of free food relief to famine refugees. So the county magistrate, that's the lowest level official, he and his local level elite workers have to go into each village, work with the local elites to figure out, they categorize people into 3 groups: the most poor, the Jipin, the middle poor, and the least poor. And you give each family relief grain based on their category. And of course, there's corruption. It's not always perfect. But basically, in some cases, in this famous famine in the 1740s, you end up feeding huge amounts of people in an entire province for 8 months. You know, the government is giving out grain relief for 8 months during this massive famine. And then at times you step in, and if people sold their land for cheap during the famine, then you actually force the seller to sell the land back after the famine, which the British think is insane. I mean, the British just go crazy about that, you know, private property. They think that's horrible. So basically, your job as a state is to intervene. That is what you do. And if you don't, you're not benevolent, right? So how do the Qing rulers come to these ideas? Why do they think intervention is so important? And then I'll show you that, you know, by the end of the 19th century, this is running into real problems. It's not holding up very well. Basically, it's a very long path. It's a very old path. According to Confucian ideology, the emperor is the father and the mother of the people. It's your job to treat the people as your children, nourish them, teach them right from wrong. And it's their job to obey you like a filial child and to do what you say, but you must be benevolent, right? If you're not benevolent, then you're going to run into problems because according to Confucianism, the emperor is in power because of Tianming, because of the mandate of heaven. Heaven is an impersonal force, not exactly like a personal god, but heaven puts an imperial family in power. And as long as that family treats the people as a father and mother and rules benevolently, then he retains the mandate. But if the emperor displeases heaven, and one of the prime ways of displeasing heaven is to not act as a father and mother of the people, then heaven will send warnings. And a major warning is a flood or a drought. And if you don't respond to that warning, then you're going to be in trouble. Then heaven may take away the mandate. Okay, so this is all very ancient, these ideas. This is Mencius, famous Confucian philosopher. I love this, it's just so blunt. He's talking to this local ruler who's complaining that he doesn't have enough people in his area. And Mencius says, well, when people drop dead from starvation, you don't realize you've got to distribute grain. When people die, you say, it's not my fault, it's the fault of the harvest. How is that different from killing a man while running him through, saying all the time, it's none of my doing, it's the fault of the weapon, right? It's very, very blunt. Stop blaming the harvest, you idiot, and people will come to you, right? A very, very blunt thing. And then another really famous Confucian, sort of a foundational Han Dynasty scholar who gets quoted all the time, he says, listen, emperor, when you have these anomalies, floods and droughts and weird eclipses and so forth, it's because there's a problem in your state. And if there's a problem, heaven will warn you, right? Heaven is reasonable. But if you get warned and you do nothing, then you're going to be overtaken, right? So very important. And then just to move up to the 19th century, in 1644, the Manchus take over China. So it's actually not a Han Chinese dynasty, but the Manchus bring all of these Confucian ideas, accept them in some ways, are more Confucian than the Ming. And so they're still carrying out these ideas. And just some quotes from my own research to show that these ideas last into the 1870s. Here, basically, the court is responding, the Qing court, by saying, there's this drought, so we've got to figure out what's wrong with us, right? And if we can figure out why heaven is angry with us, then peace will return to the people, right? This is a Qing official talking about the famine. Why are all these disasters? I believe that we've offended heaven. I'm trying to figure out why. How is this different or similar to providentialism? I mean, there's some interesting, it's similar in some ways, but there's a different locus to it. Right? Yeah.
Message about individual people versus message about the whole state.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Who's getting laid, right? So both Adams, or Malthus, right? Since he's a pastor, we'll use Malthus. Since Malthus and these Chinese, whether it's the Qing court or an official, they all agree that heaven is involved, right? These are not secular societies. They believe that when there's a terrible drought or a potato blight, heaven is involved, right? But they don't agree on who, as you said, who's getting blamed. So the British are saying, heaven is teaching you starving Irish people a lesson, right? So you guys have messed up. Heaven is mad at you. We can't intervene and blunt this. The Chinese are saying, there's this horrible drought. Heaven is mad at the emperor, at the high officials, right? It's the people at the top who heaven deals with. We've got to figure out what we've done wrong, and then there'll be rain. So very different flavor, although they both agree about that heaven is there. So this means that you've got to carry out all this array of practical strategies because you really believe, and I think they really do believe, I don't think it's rhetoric, that if you do not respond to heaven's warning, you're going to get overthrown, right? And another reason the Qing state believes this in the 1870s is they've just gone through 3 major uprisings, right? The Taiping rebellion, Nian rebellion, Muslim rebellion. So they've had a very vivid example of what happens if the state is not treating the people benevolently, you're going to get overthrown, right? So they very much think we need to react here in a manner to show heaven that we are being benevolent. But by the late 19th century, the Qing state is unable to do what it could do in the 18th century. And here's a very interesting world history reason, right? We all know about the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is crucial for the Irish because it brings the potato over, and hence we get a bigger population and dependency on the potato. It's equally crucial for China. We all know, right? I'm sure you teach your students that sweet potatoes and peanuts and all those New World crops make it over to Asia. What we may not be quite so familiar with, I don't know, is that it leads to this incredible skyrocketing of the population in China, right? So you can see here that New World crops are coming in by the early 1700s, and that is when we see this population explode, right? The poor in South China who cannot plant rice on very sandy, boggy land are able to plant potatoes and sweet potatoes, and that radically increases your ability to reproduce and to feed large numbers of people. Of course, there are other reasons. It's also peace and stability during this time period under the Qing, but the population skyrockets, and that begins to lead to all kinds of internal problems. Deforestation, tension between Han and non-Han peoples over land that leads to rebellions, deforestation leading to over-silting of the rivers and runoff leading to floods. Just a series of disasters that are related to rapidly rising population. And then in addition to these internal problems, ecological collapse and overpopulation and rebellions, we have obviously the external problems, the Opium War, the arrival of the industrialized West, the treaty port system, all that you teach students about when you talk about imperialism. One really good source on this, some of you may know this book, is Mike Davis's Late Victorian Holocausts, where he talks about all of these famines that are happening in the 1870s, not just the Chinese one, but in India, in Brazil, parts of Ethiopia, and he links them to the industrialized West and imperialism in very interesting ways. So basically, by the 1870s, we have intense pressure on the Chinese through both opium, the Opium War, the Second Opium War in 1856 to 1860, the treaties that forced China to open more and more ports to foreign trade. And we basically have, semi-colonialism in China by the 1870s. And that situation, combined with all these massive internal rebellions in the 1850s and 60s, forces the Qing government into a really tough choice when this famine happens, right? So in 1877, the rhetoric is nourish the people. But the reality is we no longer have 1 million tons of grain in our granaries. We've had to open our granaries to feed the military, to protect China's coasts, and to fight these rebels. So what are we going to spend our limited funds on? Are we going to try to modernize to fight the West? Are we going to build railroads and steamships and defend our coasts? Or are we going to try to win the people's hearts and prevent rebellion by feeding the people, right? And so you have this very interesting debate at the top levels of the Chinese government. You have the self-strengtheners, the Chinese reformers like Li Hongzhang, who may be a familiar name, who say basically feeding the people is crucial, but there's these nasty, smelly, hairy, dangerous Western barbarians on our coast. We've got to defend the country. So we've got to put our money into steamships and guns and coastal defense. We can't take coastal defense money and use it to feed the peasants in North China. Very important voice. But there's this other group of officials who in histories of China usually get a bad rap because they're very conservative. But in this case, I think they're very interesting. They basically say, and this is from archives that I used in my book, and these are important officials, conservatives. They say, listen, it's important to defend the country, but people are starving to death. And the job of a benevolent government is to nourish the people. So let's take money from coastal defense and forward it to North China to buy grain, okay, to move grain up into North China. And so these guys, this particular guy, Jiang Guanjun, he wants the Qing government to take half of all its coastal defense funds and move it to famine relief and close down these self-strengthening things because he thinks, that this is more urgent. Li Hongzhang has a fit. They fight back and forth, the self-strengtheners versus the conservatives. And in the end, the Qing state is, as usual at that time, kind of stymied, can't do either one. They end up taking some coastal defense money to feed famine victims, but it's not enough. You still have a huge death rate, and of course they're not able to defend their coast either. So this is, it's not a very successful story, but I think it's interesting because it shows you how much ideology impacts a state, even when they're in a really bad situation, right? A much worse situation than the British are in the 1840s. But the Qing state still makes much more of an effort to take on this role because of their belief that that's what governing means. Okay, so switching gears because of time to how this looks on the individual and familial level, and I think this is really interesting. Famines force individuals and families to make hideous choices as well as governments, right? So I'm very interested in the question of how religious or cultural or gender norms shape the choices people make when there's not enough food to feed all the people in your family. So I want to start with this famous famine story from Ireland. This is not a primary source. This is a novel, but it's the most famous Irish famine novel. It's quoted all the time, Liam O'Flaherty's Famine. It's published in the early 20th century, so it's not a primary source. But you have similar narratives, but just this is such a powerful one from the Irish famine itself. So this narrative is one that I would think that we as people from a Western country would find fairly familiar. All right, so in the novel, Mary is this young woman with a young child, a young boy, a young baby, and her husband is taken off to prison for joining an anti-landlord riot. They depend on potatoes, their crop fails, they're starving. And Mary is trying to take care of her elderly father-in-law and her own elderly mother and her son. And eventually she runs out of food and realizes that somebody's going to have to die, basically. I mean, it's fairly blunt. And she decides that she and her husband are going to flee to America on a ship with their child and leave her mother and father-in-law to starve, basically. She keeps this a secret, but her elderly father-in-law, I think he's 72, figures it out and shouts at her, "Was that your plan, to desert us? Is that what you're up to?" And her answer, "You just aren't going to have this in China. You're not going to have somebody say this. I've never seen anything like this in a Chinese famine story. You'd rather leave your son and me die until he gets hung? Is that the kind of father you are? You only think of yourself. You're old. You only have a few years to live. We're young. Let us live," right? And then the father-in-law agrees, right? Because this is the Western cultural context. "God forgive me, I didn't think of it that way. You're right, daughter." Okay, right? So that is a very, I think, not particularly surprising choice, that the old should be left behind, the young should live. At the very end of the novel, Mary and her husband and child are safe on an immigrant ship. And the father-in-law is digging a hole for his dead wife, a grave, and he falls and dies by this tree, accompanied by his dog, who's howling as he dies. And it's implied, although not stated, that the dog is going to eat his corpse. But that's the end of the novel. But the young have escaped, right? Now here is an equally interesting famine morality choice from the Chinese famine. This is one of those illustrations from those Shanghai philanthropists. The old mother is too hungry to get up. My little daughter is too hungry to make a sound. If the daughter dies, you can bear another. If the mother dies, she can never live again. The old mother's life is precious. The daughter's life is light. So he decides to kill the daughter to feed the mother. But as he's holding the knife, he can't do it. Tears of blood fall. How could the old woman want this cup of broth? How could she want this? He can't bear to take his child and boil her, so he sends her to the market to exchange her for 1 or 2 pints of grain. All right, so here's your Confucian, very similar setting, right? But a very different moral choice. So he ends up being unable to kill the child, but he can sell the child to save his elderly mother. And this basic idea is from a more ancient story, the classic of filial piety, one of the great Confucian texts that everybody had to memorize as children. This is the story of Guoju, and this is, again, a really famous story in China. Guoju and his wife were a really model filial son and model daughter-in-law. They had a 3-year-old son, only son, and his elderly mother. A famine struck, and at first he and his wife gave all the food to his mother and their 3-year-old son, and they ate herbs and grass and tree bark. But as the famine went on, they couldn't feed both of them. So Guoju says, "It's a famine year and grain is expensive. My mother is old. We must do our best to take care of her, but I fear it won't be enough. Now our son takes part of mother's food, so mother cannot eat her fill. It's better that we bury our son in order to take care of mother. If mother dies, we can never have another. If our son dies, we can bear another. Aside from this, there's no way. His wife agrees because this is the moral choice. They go out to dig a hole to bury the son. This is a famous picture that's in a lot of these filial piety narratives. But because of his filial heart, as they're digging the hole, heaven provides them with a pot of gold. And so they're able to feed both. So this is your quintessential morality tale. And what I think is so interesting about it is that it's very clear that even if it's a boy, right? In Confucian China, the boy is crucial for carrying on the family line and sacrificing to the ancestors. But filial piety is so strong that this elderly mother trumps even your only son because of filial piety. And so that's very interesting. And I would just go on to say that when I was teaching in China, I had a class of 90 college sophomores, and this was before this research, but just I had these icebreaker questions that I would use with them, and one of the silly icebreaker questions was, if your parent and your child is tied up on a railroad track and the train is coming, who do you save? And you can only save one. I mean, it's a silly question. I just want them to talk. But what interested me was that in all three of my classes, in all three settings, 30 students per class, nobody ever said they would save the child. They all said they would save the parent. And when I would say why, maybe it was peer pressure, I mean, I don't know. But when I would ask why, because they had to talk, they would say, well, because my parents suffered so much to raise me, because they gave everything for me, because they worked so hard to send me to college, because I have to repay them. You could have another child, you can't have another parent, just like this. So, this kind of idea is really important, I think, today as well as in the past. And I think if you're teaching Confucianism, it's a really interesting way of doing it. And I can't tell you how many times I've had one of my Asian American students come up to me after my standard lecture on Confucianism, where I always talk about this kind of thing, and say, I never knew why my parents were like that. And now it makes sense, because they'd heard this same idea growing up, and it made them realize, oh, that's a Confucian idea, right? That, So I think in an American classroom, you get a much more mixed response. I've tried that with my classes. Some people say they'd save their parent, some people say they'd save their kid, but it's never that kind of all one answer that I was getting. Yeah, and so anyway, a lot of this comes out of this idea that filial piety is the root of all virtue. Without it, you don't have anything. Okay, so yeah, I'm not gonna have time for all this, but I'll show you a few of the slides, and if you're interested, you can ask questions. But I think another way of looking at famine is what images do different cultures choose to make clear the horror of mass starvation. And there's really great literature on images of the Irish famine. And one of my favorite books is this book by Margaret Kellner, who makes the point that the vast majority of famine images are of women and children, not just in Ireland, but today, if you think about pictures, it's women and children, because we see that as a way, I think, to show horror. And she goes through this whole array of feminized images from the Irish famine, and almost all of them have to do with mothers. Okay, it's almost always a mother who can't feed her child, a mother who's died and the baby's sucking at the dead breast, and mothers who have to choose between their children, and all of these mother figures. In China, it's really different. It's also feminized, but the way it's feminized is very different. So these images of famine that I had for my book, and also textual and visual, the big deal in China is this selling women so that your starving family can survive. And that was a huge problem because one of the key virtues for women in Qing China was being chaste. And so if you're a widow, you're not supposed to remarry. If you're not yet married, you're certainly not supposed to be having sex. And so selling your wife or selling your daughter because the family can't survive, selling her as a concubine or a prostitute, or if you're lucky, as a wife, that breaks her chastity, and that is a huge problem. So in Chinese famine narratives, we've got all this literature about the horror of daughters and wives being sold, and then the pain and suffering of these women who are forced to be sold and give up their chastity. and then a whole array of literature about the suicide of women who'd rather starve to death or kill themselves than be sold and lose their chastity. And so it's interesting to me because the feminization is still there. It's women, not men, who are being talked about, but it's such a different feminization than the Irish feminization. I think that's interesting. Okay, and last but not least, I'll go through these quickly, but if you have questions, you can ask more. I think that what items become food as people grow more and more desperate is also culturally defined to some extent. And I was curious in the question of, to what degree are famine foods universal or culturally specific? And just to get, what would you be willing to eat to stay alive, right? Okay. So I think in the Chinese case, it's very interesting because China had so many famines in the north because of its very dense population and drought-prone northern provinces, that you have this whole literature of government-sponsored famine volumes on what you can eat during a famine. So 1400, you've got this famous famine food book published by a local literati who goes through in great detail, talks about all these different foods you can eat when the crops fail, right? And the government publicizes his book. Then in World War II, you've got this great story. I'm studying the Henan famine right now. I'm looking at how Chinese responses to famine change in the 20th century. But in this famine, I have all these interesting local sources about this official who gets a lot of publicity in the newspapers because he develops 3 famine foods and eats them himself to make sure they're safe. And then all these newspapers publicize them, and people, supposedly you've got these magic foods that if you eat it for 1 day, you can live for 7 days. And the recipes are really quite appalling. It's like husks of corn mixed with the beans that you normally can't eat, mixed with white earth clay, and very iffy, but yeah. And then in the Great Leap Famine, the Mao era famine in the communist period, again, the state responded to so-called natural disasters. They wouldn't admit that there was a famine, but by launching a campaign to come up with scientific substitute foods, and then publicize those substitute foods such as algae, synthetic foods, buns made out of corn husk. So you have this whole literature of state-run famine foods in China. Local level famine foods, things that keep coming up over and over again. This really interested me. Famine stories from the 1870s, famine photos from the Henan wartime famine in 1942, very similar. People cutting the tree bark in order to eat that to survive. That's a really shocking picture. Another really common one is this Guanyin Tu, which was supposed to be clay that was from the Guanyin Bodhisattva that you could eat, this white clay that would fill the belly. Although there are a lot of stories about people who eat this clay from the Buddha and then they're so constipated that they die because of that. And then in Chinese local texts, the last thing you eat is always human flesh, but there's a huge literature of cannibalism in Chinese famine stories all the way through, from imperial period, 1942, communist famine, you get the same narrative. Basically, the narrative is like this. First grassroots, then the tree bark, then you eat people who died, and then you kill people and eat them. And this, I think a lot of this is, I hope, metaphorical. The chapter in my book talks about cannibalism as a metaphor for the complete destruction of Confucian morality. But I've now seen so many instances of cannibalism in official sources from the 1942 and 1958 famine that I really can no longer say it's metaphorical. I mean, clearly there's some cannibalism going on because you've got these very dry government reports listing very specific cases. So that is a really big deal in Chinese famine literature. First of all, corpses, and then killing people. In the Shanghai philanthropy book, there's this very evocative illustration where you have a local philanthropist who goes by a shop that's selling human meat and he sees a woman who's about to be eaten, and he rushes back to his house to get money to buy her back. But by the time he arrives, she's already been slaughtered. So part of this is using cannibalism as an appeal for aid. You know, look at what's happening. We've got to help. But unfortunately, it seems that there was also some literal cannibalism because it is such a big part of the narrative. But I still think that part of the way it's talked about is metaphorical because it's overturning all of the Confucian hierarchy, right? So you've got younger brothers eating elders, wives eating husbands, the same thing, children eating their parents, blah, 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 blah. So in all of these cases, you've got the Confucian oral order being completely destroyed. This is from a stele that I saw in a county in Shanxi province. So some of it literal, but some of it a way of talking about the ultimate immorality, right, in cannibal literature. In Ireland, it's just not time to go through it, but I think the potato is famous. You know, the whole Columbian Exchange, the potato in world history, a mixed blessing, helps the Irish population rise, but then leads to this dependency on the potato and eventually contributes to the famine. The potato in China arrives, helps the poor to survive, but also leads to this skyrocketing of population that causes problems. In Ireland, the famine foods are somewhat different than China. The most common image that I kept coming upon is people who die with their mouths being green because of eating grass. So that was interesting that, that really isn't, you see that a little bit in the Chinese case, but it's a much bigger image in the Irish case. That really caught people's attention, the green mouths. And then another aspect of famine food in Ireland is this idea that the government does bring in some shipments of Indian corn from the US, but the Irish at first find it to be loathsome, right? Because they're not used to eating corn. It's hard to cook, it's hard to grind up, and it makes them sick. It's hard to digest. And so at the beginning, Indian corn is seen as not an appropriate food for Ireland. But as the starvation continues, then it becomes more popular. But the government then, you have a change in government from the Conservatives to the Whigs, and the government stops importing it anyway. So it becomes another food image in Ireland that you don't see in China at all is this idea of Protestant mission groups feeding Catholics, but only if the Catholics will agree to either convert or get Protestant religious instruction. And so you have this whole term of people who've given up their faith in order to eat. And that is something that I've never seen in the Chinese famine literature, but that's important in Ireland. I looked for cannibalism stuff in Ireland because it's so present in the Chinese literature. It's just not a big image in the Chinese case. You see hints of it. You have dogs eating corpses. You've got these starving babies biting at the breasts of their mothers. You have occasional stories of mothers who are tempted to eat their children, but in the stories I've read, they don't. I mean, it's always, sort of hinted at, but not actually carried out. So it's just a very different image than you have in China, where that's a major part of how you talk about famine. So in conclusion, my thesis would be that how people from different cultures and time periods respond to the lack of food tells us a lot about state ideology, gender systems, family systems, ultimate values. And I guess I just think this could be something you might use with students and get them thinking about how would our cultural norms and our ideology shape how we would respond to the lack of food. So thank you.
So we were running a little late, so I prefer to
yeah, sorry.
just a couple of questions maybe from people who haven't, yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, in famine Ireland, the main alternative to starving was
immigration.
And
Yes.
in fact, equal numbers died
Yeah.
and emigrated.
Yeah, good point.
Was that seen in
Yeah.
China as an alternative?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I could have brought that up. Well, the issue in China, yes, you certainly have people who try desperately to escape, but the problem is that it's a 5-province drought. So in the epicenter in Shanxi, there's lots of stories about people who try to flee, but all the provinces around them also have a drought. So they end up dying on the roads. You're weak. There's no easy, you can't get to a port and immigrate, and it's landlocked, and you just can't walk that far. So in terms of immigration, sure, you have people fleeing, but it doesn't seem to save a lot of lives. It's because of the distance and the fact that it's just this huge area that is dealing with famine. So, yeah.
We talk about providentialism and how the Church of England responds.
Mm-hmm.
How does the Catholic Church respond to Ireland?
Yeah. Well, that was, yeah. Well, gosh, yes, I vaguely remember the Pope makes some kind of donation, but I don't remember how much. Queen Victoria, the Ottoman Sultan, the Pope all provided some amount of monetary relief. But, you know, Christine Kinnelly has a really good chapter on potatoes and philanthropy where she talks about relief efforts from different groups. But she doesn't talk about a major Catholic. I know that seems strange. There's an American, Irish Catholic Americans who try to raise money. But of course, it's not the huge number of them that are there after the famine. So I guess my honest answer is I don't really know. But in what I've read, I haven't seen it as a huge relief effort. It's not one of the groups that's mentioned as having a really, I don't know, does somebody else know more?
Yeah, I should just say briefly, this is the only time my degree in Celtic studies might be used.
There you go. Maybe you can answer our question.
Not for very long.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a lot of relief attempted, but totally subversively by Catholic priests. Because they had a totally different, their entire relationship to their heritage.
Well, sure, it's different, yeah.
Well, no, it had to be covered. It had to be clandestine throughout all that period. And it did extend to the provision of such philanthropy as they
Could give.
Which of course wasn't greater often than that of farmers. But there was an enormous amount of what they could do being done, but it was all clandestine.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
They have no power.
Right, they had no power, yeah.
Power.
I'm just interested by that question because I realize I just simply haven't come across it very much, which is odd. You would think I would have seen more of that in this reading, but yeah, so thank you. That's, yeah. Yes?
A few years ago in O.R.I.A.S, we had a middle school history teacher, and he was a really good teacher, and he was telling us how he knew he got through to his students when some of them asked him, how much money does a historian make? And the same teacher, he was saying, how do you teach something as abstract as filial piety? Foreign, it's not abstract, but it's foreign. And so he did an assignment with his class, and he said, for 1 week, I want you to be really nice to everybody in your family, and then, or friends, wherever you go, boss times. And we'll talk about it in a week when you come back. And so when he asked him what happened, and he said, gosh, it was odd. Everybody was being heckin' nice.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, well, I think you could use some of this. Like, I think you could talk about the choices in a way that would be interesting to high school students. Get them thinking. I think it works with college students at least. Yeah.
You were talking about the ideological foundations for the British response.
Yeah.
A lot of what you were pointing out sounds to me like social Darwinism.
Yeah. So it's right at that same time period. Yeah. It's a little bit, Spencer is writing right around then, isn't he? But, so I guess, we're coming right to that, but I was looking at sort of how we get there. Yeah, I didn't see in the 1870s stuff, I don't remember any direct mention of Spencer or mention of Darwin in the North China Herald stuff, because that would have leaped out at me. But certainly it's in the water. You're right. that way of thinking that you just let people be winnowed out. Sure, you're right. It sounds very Darwinian, but I didn't see them actually mention that. But yeah, good point. Yeah, okay.
In my understanding, in Confucian hierarchy, farmers are valued more highly than merchants.
Yes.
Does that play into the Defense and Famine response as well?
Yes, actually, that's a really good point. Yes, definitely, because merchants are the parasites, right? They're at the bottom. They don't create any goods. So, yes, the Confucian literati and the governing officials they're not particularly interested in protecting the rights of merchants. So in that sense, it's very different than the British mercantile, than the British government. So I think, yeah, that's a good point. It's much more important to get the farmers back producing because it's not a commercial empire, it's an agrarian empire. You desperately need your farmers to be able to produce. So yeah, I think that's a very good point. Yeah.
Well, I think I'm going to move us into our own lap. We don't want to have any famines.
That's right.
No problem, I can assure you. But Kay's going to stay around during lunch, and if you have other questions that come up, I'm sure she'll answer them between bites.
Yes. All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much.